Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to the few people in the East that are on this call. This is the WPTF the immediate after action report, where we've got Carrie Bentley, our chair of our CAISO committee, and also the principal for Gridwell Consulting, and Jeff Richter from Energy GPS, a WPTF member, who is Carrie is going to share her expertise and reflections on what happened last week based on CAISO data that's been made available. CAISO has gotten better and better providing transparent information on the market, and we thank them for that. That's what's allowing Carrie to do this pretty quick review of what the last week looked like, or actually it was about 10 days worth of emergency. Jeff and the folks at Energy GPS do a great job in terms of looking at the markets, all of the markets, including CAISO, but what I particularly enjoy is their view of the surrounding area around California, because as we were just discussing, California can't exist without the rest of the West, and of course the rest of the West should like selling to California. It's a symbiotic relationship, and I think that will demonstrate itself even more as we go into today's webinar, which is why I was always musing about, let's just skip this day ahead thing and go straight to an RTO, but I don't want to belabor that point. What we're going to do, because we've got quite a few people on this webinar, we're going to first go with Carrie's presentation. There's a lot of information which will be made available on both Gridwell's website as well as WPTF's website. And then we'll have questions, and we can entertain questions any one of two ways. One can be in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A function next to the chat box. Or you can just raise your hand, and we can unmute you when you want to ask a question. We're going to try and hold questions at the end of each presentation so that we can get through what is a lot of information. I think that'll work a little bit better rather than interrupting with questions along the way. Of course, people can be chatting with each other in the chat box. We'll then, once we do questions with Carrie, we'll then move on to Jeff's presentation. Again, Jeff's presentation will also be available on the Energy GPS website as well as the WPTF website in PDF form, so you'll be able to access it. And we're also recording this presentation, so some of your colleagues who may be busy will be able to come back and hear the recording. I think that's everything we want to cover.
And why are we doing this now, Scott, and not a week from now when we might have a little bit more time?
Well, we're doing this now, for one thing, because we could be having another emergency in September. But again, we're doing this now because we can, because of the information that we've got. But also, I think we may find at the end of this presentation that we may have raised enough questions in terms of discussion items for the future that we may want to have a roundtable, to discuss the implications as we digest them. But the bottom line is, we're having this now because A, we can, because CAISO's made the information available, but B, we could be having these events on a more frequent basis. And I think we need to start the discussion of how to digest this. And we may be back at you for like a roundtable someplace in Portland to discuss what the next steps and how we have to figure out, given increased load and demand in the Pacific Northwest that may we got lucky in several ways on this heat wave, and so we need to plan for the next one as an industry. So with that, I think why don't we turn it over to Carrie for her presentation on the sort of immediate after action report.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think that's a good way to tee it up. I really think that we did not end up blacking out due to effective grid management and a dash of luck. We were pretty lucky, and if we see another heat wave, I think it'll be good to do some quick lessons learned. I want to emphasize that this is just initial reflections. The CAISO has been amazing and transparent about putting out data almost instantaneously in real time. So we actually have data that we could present to you, which we couldn't even just 2 years ago during the August 2020 blackouts. So I think that's great. But because it is so instantaneous after the event, I think there's still some work to do, and we'll reflect more. And as Scott said, I think a roundtable on the subject would be wonderful. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carrie Bentley. I'm the CEO of Gridwell Consulting. Along with Callie Wells, we run what's called the CAISO committee at the Western Power Trading Forum. So these views are purely my own. They don't necessarily reflect WPTF or any of our individual members. I always put this disclaimer slide up here, and this is more true than ever. This data in here reflects what is posted on the CAISO's website and what is available right now. Price corrections, discrepancies, errors all come up all the time. So this is just using best available data, which can always change later on. I'm going to go into 3 things on my part of the presentation, just the impact of the heat wave on grid reliability. I'm going to walk through it in a bit of detail because there was a lot of information being thrown at us in real time. And so I just want to take it step by step and really walk through what happened. Then just do a bit of a deeper dive, pulling in some more historical analysis and putting things in context. And then finally, maybe say 1 or 2 things, depending on time, about preparing for the next decade and what this means going forward. So first, the heat wave. I love this little dog so much. I think I could just happily present with this as my background, but unfortunately I have a lot of complicated slides for you going forward. But all right, the heat wave. So as everyone knows, there was record-breaking heat. If anyone attended my August 2020 talk on that heat wave, you'll remember perhaps that I scoffed at it a bit. I made fun of the fact everyone called it a heat storm. The heat then, to me, it was a normal heat wave. But this is actually a heat event. We did see record-breaking temperatures across multiple cities across California for multiple days. It truly did have an impact on demand, which is what we care about in the electrical industry, in a way that we haven't seen previously. So to reflect that, I pulled in all the annual peaks at the CAISO from 2013 to 2021. So you'll see here the other peak events. And I went back for the ones I could, and most of these only were for 1 or 2 days where you had, for example, in 2017, we had 50,000 megawatts, and that was the peak load that year. But it only lasted for a day or 2. It wasn't this sustained high peak period. So you'll see here, 1 or 2 days, 1 or 2 days, and then I overlaid this with the entire week. So this was the peak on the 1st, on September 1st, 2nd, 3rd, etc. So you really see this whole period was higher or equal to all the peaks we've had previously. So, quite hot, quite high demand. You could also see this in the effect of grid conditions over time. So what a grid condition alert is when the CAISO sends out a signal for various reasons. It starts with a flex alert, which is merely, consumers, please start to conserve energy during this period. And then it gets increasingly more urgent, and different things happen as different alerts are deployed. So you can see over time, we usually have a few flex alerts each year. We sometimes get into watch or warning stages, but very rarely have we gone into stage 2 emergencies or stage 3 or EEA2 or an EEA3. It's a little harder to talk about now because we have moved from what used to be called the AWE system, alerts, watches, and emergencies, something like that, AWE, to what's called the EEA system. That was to align CAISO's alerts with NERC and then other BAAs. That did cause some issues. So you see right here, we have the stage 3 emergency. So how do we translate, what I think most of us are used to into the EEAs? Because it's important to get this straight as we're talking about what actually happened. And it did lead to quite a bit of confusion, unfortunately, including one scheduling coordinator actually dropping load because they misunderstood that an EEA3 is not actually what a stage 3 was. So this is from the KISO's training. If you haven't done the training, you might want to like pop in and look at this presentation. But you could see that before, what just was an alert is now called an EEA watch. And what was the previous warning is an EEA1. So one thing I noticed that happened is when the KISO first called the EEA1, people got a little excited and were like, oh, grid conditions, you know, that as if it was equivalent to a stage 1, but it's not. An EEA1 is just a warning. And you actually have to get to EEA2 to start triggering your demand response programs. And that's really key because until you hit that EEA2, we don't actually see pricing impacted in the market. And so again, we had that confusion where before in stage 1 in the old world, that's when demand response would already have been triggered. Now we actually have to get to EEA2 for the DR to be triggered. And then finally, we go to EEA3, which is a combination of stage 2 and stage 3. And this is really what led to the confusion, which caused the entity to accidentally drop only about, I heard about 47 megawatts of load, but they did drop load and implement rolling outages because of this confusion. So EEA3 now has 2 parts. It has the arming load part and the dropping load part. Whereas before we had stage 2, which was arming load, and then we had stage 3, which was dropping load. In my mind, perhaps that was a bit more clear. And now we really have to pay a lot more attention to what the KISO is actually saying, and we can't just use EEA3 for shorthand. Okay, so just to bring it all together on the EEAs, EEA2, that's when you have demand response. EEA3 is now when the KISO can arm load, which means they could prepare to drop load, and they could use that to satisfy their non-spin requirements in AS, which would allow other resources to serve energy, basically. So EEA3 is you can arm load, and then only if they need to do they drop load. But all that happens under that EEA3 umbrella. So we did hit EEA3, but we did not drop load in California. Okay, so now stepping back, I'm going to walk through when things really got shaky. So as I illustrated earlier, yes, things started to get hot September 1st, but it was really September 5th in the day ahead summer report where we really noticed, okay, things are going to be tight. So this report is a little confusing, so I just want people to focus on 3 things. And you'll notice that I abbreviated this chart for ease because we really only care about the peak periods. So here's the day ahead forecast. And what this is it's the day ahead forecast used in the KISO's residual unit commitment run. So after the day ahead market and the financial market runs, the KISOs goes back and they say, okay, do we have enough physical resources to ensure reliability for tomorrow? And so the way they do that is they they kick out all the virtuals, they adjust for wind and solar, and they say, okay, do we have enough physical supply to meet the KISO forecast of KISO demand? And so here's the day ahead forecast. And what they do is they ensure they meet this. And if they meet this, then they do not drop high priority exports. Now, if they meet this, they have to meet the day ahead forecast plus what's called the rough forecast adjustment, this column right here. What that is operator bias. I think they do it now through an actual formula, but what it is they're ramping up the day ahead forecast to really say, okay, we need to get a lot more supply online. And if you can't meet the rough forecast plus the day ahead forecast, that's this column right here, the shortfall. Oh, this column, sorry, right here, the shortfall. And that means the KISO starts cutting low priority exports. So what we saw on September 5th is in the day ahead market, the KISO didn't cut any high priority exports because they could still meet their day ahead forecast, but they couldn't meet the forecast plus the adjustment. So they cut what's called low priority exports. So already we're in a position where the KISO knows they can't support what cleared in the day ahead market. Then we go into real time. So sometime in the morning, I think about 9 a.m., the KISO calls that EEA1, And remember, EEA1 isn't that exciting. It just means, start to conserve, utilities can think about using their programs, but can't use DR or anything yet. And they called the EEA1 for, hour 17. And then there was a flex alert called. Then as we moved on through the day, so we're about hour 17, that's when we start to get worried. What happens toward the end of hour 17 is that an EEA2 is called. So this is when the demand response programs start kicking in. Now here is where I think additional confusion happened, because I see this multiple times where I start to see some sort of unexpected dip in load after the EEA2 is called. So during that time period, the alert goes out. It seems like some DR or something starts to kick in at that time, even though the EEA2 is called for a time in the future. So even though the EEA2 alert was called right here in this first purple bar, it says, no, I don't actually want you to start to conserve until later, until 1830. But you end up seeing almost an instantaneous dip. So I think there may be some confusion on whether the IOUs are allowed to begin their DR programs or should begin their DR programs when that alert goes out versus when it's called for. So, some lessons learned there. So we had 2 EEA2s called on September 5th, and then we also armed RMR as ancillary services. So we have reliability must-run resources, which are paid, by the CAISO market. Or sorry, paid not by the CAISO market or through RA, but paid by the CAISO as a fixed bilateral payment to be used during emergencies or basically when needed. So they used RMR as the peak was going down here. But we survived, no blackouts here. Then on September 6th, again, this just seemed really confusing to me as a day. So in the morning again, EEA1 is called for hour 16. Then the next thing that happens is then EEA2 is called for hour 16. Flex alerts, EEA watch was even before it, hasn't been called yet. I think they just forgot about them maybe, I don't know, because then, 40 minutes later, they call those lower items, which is very confusing because did you move from an EEA2 to an EEA watch? Are things getting better? Or are you just trying to somehow get more resources online? It was quite confusing. Then we move on through the day, and this time we end up having to use RMR as energy, which is a bad sign. That means we're just using absolutely every resource we need to use. And then at the same time, this demand response event is called, that's this kind of orange, shading, I don't know what color that would be called, cantaloupe maybe. So this cantaloupe box indicates that we have a demand response event for this whole period, which means that this only shows up if the CAISO is calling more than 200 megawatts of DR. So this means they're just calling DR after DR after DR. And then finally, we end up in 1735, getting into an EEA3. This is where there was some confusion, a little bit of load accidentally dropped, but the CAISO did not order rolling blackouts. And then finally, this bar it's not a great bar, guys, I'm sorry, but it represents the emergency alert. So for those of you not in California, most Californians got this really annoying alarm on our phones, and it said conserve energy. And I think people did for the most part. There's still some academic debate about how significant that response was. But to me, looking through the data, it seems pretty significant. It certainly seems more significant than any individual DR program I've seen before. And here, this is another way to kind of see that same data. So what this is that just ignore the purple. That's just flex or net demand. We don't need to think about that right now. But if you just look at this turquoise, this is demand for the day. And then you see this little dip down right here. That's when the emergency response was called. And you see it almost instantaneously being dropped and dropped for a sustained period of time before evening out. So to me, it looks like it was pretty effective. You can't use cell phone alerts all the time to save the grid, but in this case, to me, it looks like we did prevent an outage because of it. Speaking of outages, okay, so effective grid management, every CAISO called all the alerts. I heard, from multiple load serving entities that they were running their diesel generators. They were doing as much as they can with their own demand response programs behind the scenes. So effective grid management, I think, on all sides. Also a dash of luck. We didn't have any major outages on the 5th and 6th, and especially the 6th, when I think we were in probably the most dire situation. Ormond Beach from GenOn was out on the 2nd, and that's why you have this higher number here, but luckily it was able to come back online. So pretty good all around with outages. I will note that there are 2 outage reports on the CAISO's website. There's the AM report, and then there's another snapshot midday. And the midday snapshot had significantly more resources on outage at different points in time, and I'm still digging into that data. But overall, if you compare, for example, the amount of natural gas we have on the system to what was being produced during the max, it matches up almost perfectly. So if you take the Pmax of all natural gas and you subtract 2,432 megawatts, you literally almost get the amount of natural gas producing during the peak per CAISO data. You know, generally, again, this is from the 6th. I just think this event highlights the continued need for gas resources and market imports. So no surprises here whatsoever. We are still predominantly dependent on gas resources, and imports, market imports in particular, just save our butts all the time. You know, Jeff will talk about this a lot more, but I think it's going to be really hard as the entire West decarbonizes to continue to rely on imports, and as we try and retire gas, you know, I just think this highlights challenges ahead for sure. I'll also note, you know, we do have an EIM. We were importing pretty significantly throughout the day. However, EIM is incredibly sensitive to prices, which is something I want to talk about later, and I just want you to keep this chart in the back of your head. So what this shows is imports into the CAISO from other EIM BAAs across time. And this dark kind of bluish line is RTPD, or the 15-minute market. And then this lighter line down here is the 5-minute market. So what you see when this lighter line is above this darker line, that means that in the 5-minute market, the actual real-time market, we are importing a lot less than we thought we were going to in the 15-minute market. This is particularly true in hour 16, which is, if you recall back up here, was a pretty important hour when we started using RMR as energy. Perhaps because of that, our prices took a turn, which I'll get into in a little bit, but you'll note that once RMR started to be deployed, all of a sudden we went from going to import a lot from EIM to importing almost nothing from other EIM areas. Here are the positive EIM transfers. You know, just I wanted to illustrate that, you know, basically the Southwest and Northwest were supporting everyone. So this is APS and PNM and BPA and PowerX. And they weren't just supporting California. Most of the other EIM entities were also importing for most of the day. People always ask about batteries, so I just wanted to show how the batteries were used. This could be a whole talk in and of itself. I actually think, one, the data the CAISO produces on batteries is exceptional. And then 2, it's just really fascinating to see. So just at a high level, how batteries were used across the heat wave. Initially, it was almost purely through the market. Batteries responding through price signals. There were maybe a few constraints put on, something pretty technical called the minimum online constraint, which has to do with a batteries award in a day-ahead market. That was applied a couple days, but for the most part, batteries were just effectively dispatched through prices until the 7th. And then on September 7th, the CAISO was like, nope, just kidding. And they manually dispatched everyone to like a 0 state of charge and then saved everyone for the peak. It'll be really interesting to go back and see maybe which one was more effective, allowing the markets to use the batteries, or that extreme manual intervention day. But like I said, that would be a whole talk on of itself. So just something if you're interested in, I'm happy to chat about that more with anyone. And the other thing I think is really interesting about batteries is how much ancillary services they were providing. And so this is just a chart that shows this is standalone battery AS provision, so it does not include hybrid resources. And it's showing that they're just providing a significant amount of reg up and reg down across the day. And this is the 6th again. Okay, so that's kind of just what happened as an overview. The next few slides take a bit of a deeper dive into things. So I went into 3 different aspects. I wanted to cover all the agencies equally so no one felt left out. So the CEC, the California Energy Commission, is responsible for the demand forecasts. CPUC is, for the most part, responsible for procurement requirements. So demand, supply, and then CAISO, prices and operation. I'm just going to focus on their pricing for now, but it is reliability through markets. We do ensure reliability through the market. So I'm just going to go into, how they do. So first is the California Energy Demand Forecast. So the CEC produces this forecast, but it's actually not a forecast, it's a set of forecasts. This is used in CPUC procurement when they tell load serving entities what to buy and what's called the IRP, 10 years forward, when they develop the RA requirement, when they do ad hoc procurement, they go to the CEC to get their demand forecasts. The CAISO and their transmission planning forecast also uses these. And the CEC, since the 2020 blackouts, has done tremendous work in their forecasting. They now have a high energy demand case, multiple mid energy demand cases, as well as their previous low demand case. Their high energy one is just starting to figure out how to incorporate the impacts of climate change. But it's the first time, probably one of the first agencies in the country that has done really sophisticated modeling around this. And they only started this 2 years ago. So it really is this just really significant step forward, I think, for the CEC to start to challenge, start to address challenges with fuel switching in homes when you go from gas to electric, as we start to electrify our transportation industry. All this has pretty significant impacts on demand. On top of, just COVID and climate change. So they're doing a lot of great work there. So what I did here was, I just want to say okay, well, how good of work did they do, during the heat wave? Because I think that's the real test, right? So what we have here is we have the actual demand in the CAISO for the 5th, then the 6th, and then the 7th, and then the 8th. So basically our 4 hottest days. And then what I'm doing is I'm comparing them to the 1 and 2 forecast used in the September RA requirement. So what were we using to procure RA in September? Well, that was really low. That was the mid case that went into our RA requirement was pretty significantly lower by over 8% than our peak day. If you then go into the 1 and 10 mid, we still are over that. And in fact, we're over the 1 in 20. So this is very different, for example, than 2 years ago when I think we didn't even hit the 1 in 5 mid. And now the heat wave really led to over 1 in 20 demand conditions. So you could see that, okay, these mid-case forecasts did not do a great job in setting our RA requirement or preparing us for this heat wave at all. We just, not only did we not have enough capacity, we didn't even plan to have enough capacity for an event like this. The CEC, though, as I mentioned, does do a high demand forecast. And if we look at those forecasts compared to the event and we say, okay, what if we decided as a state to plan for climate change? How well is the CEC doing? Then I would say they're doing a great job. So we're still higher, though, than the 1 and 2 for climate change, but perhaps that would be expected. And we about hit the 1 in 5. I think we just barely touch it on that highest day. So if as a state we decided, okay, we're going to plan for climate change, we're going to acknowledge it exists and start using that load forecast, I think the CEC already has one we could use. But if we continue to use the mid case and we keep seeing heat like this, there's just no way we're going to have enough internal or contracted supply to meet any sort of heat wave like this. Yep, this is just a trend. And so this is not just one event, over time, we're having more heat waves per year. They're longer, they're more intense. And then I linked to NASA because they're my favorite agency to look at heat wave events. Now, if we switch to the supply side, so here's all the NQC and specified imports that we have available for RA. I'll give my spiel that I give every time. The NQC list is just a list of available capacity, and it should be considered as the max possible available to procure. It doesn't mean it's committed to California. It doesn't mean that it's actually going to show up or even physically capable of showing up. There are some resources on the NQC list that actually can't hit their PMAX or NQC, and they choose not to sell that capacity. But they want to preserve their interconnection, and they may do upgrades, so they're on the NQC list for that amount. So if you look at September, the max possible that we could have procured between internal resources, between demand response, so DRAM/LIP and PDR is California code for utility DR programs and market demand response programs. And then if we look at specified imports, so that's resource specific resources outside the state, it's about 5,700 megawatts. So max possible was only 53,000 megawatts. So when we're talking about, targets, it would be great if we increased our demand targets, and let's say the RA requirement was higher. The reality of the situation is we simply don't have enough capacity able to be procured in the state to meet a heat wave event like that. We have to rely on the market. And that is something that, Jeff feels very passionately about, and he'll talk about more, because that has to do with external prices compared to California prices and how do we incent those resources in. But the situation we're in is very challenging. The state is quite aware of it. The CPC is aware. That's why we have massive amounts of ad hoc and urgent procurement mandates going on right now. Basically, the CAISO is building transmission as fast as they can. States procuring as many resources as they can, but we're just in a place where not enough capacity exists. And here is a fun historical trend. I actually really like this chart, guys, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes on it. So what this shows is compared to our peak today. So let's say over time, the peak was always about 51,000 megawatts. How much internal capacity, not at imports, but just, and not demand response, but just internal capacity do we have to meet this peak? And you could see that, in 2013, we would have had to rely on imports as well. But in 2014, all the way through 2018 and 19, we had enough internal capacity without having to rely on anyone to, meet a high peak load requirement. Particularly in 2017, 4,000 megawatts above that peak, which is probably why prices crashed. If you guys remember, that's about when RA was going for, system RA was like $1 per kilowatt month. We had a lot of economic retirements of gas resources because of that price. But then very rapidly, we got ourselves in a situation where now we're over, 4,000, 5,000 megawatts short to meet a peak case like that with internal supply. And I don't think we necessarily have to meet California demand with just California resources, but I think it shows you how rapidly conditions can change when you get down to really low prices and when you fail to plan for peaks that are coming just a few years away. So I think this illustrates the importance of looking out, 5 years, which is something we don't have in California. What we have is a 10-year program that looks out 10 years to build transmission and order procurement. And then we have a 1-year RA program. And in between this, we have that big nebulous gap where something like this can happen. And rapidly we can get into a situation where we don't have enough supply to meet demand. And that is just a functional process issue that we have with reliability planning in California that probably needs to be fixed pretty quickly. Okay, so now moving on, and I apologize if I'm getting any chat questions or clarifications. I'm almost done with the pricing, and then once we do that, we can.
You are, but don't worry, we're taking note of them, so we'll get to everything.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Scott. Okay, so now going on to prices. So I have a lot of charts here just because I wanted people to have the data, but I'm not going to go through all of them. So what this chart shows is the day ahead price on September 6th and this is what's called the system marginal energy cost. So it's the system price that doesn't take into account congestion or losses. And so you have the day ahead price, the day ahead SMEC in gray, and then you have the 15-minute real-time price in blue, and then you have the 5-minute real-time price in purple. And if you've heard Callie or myself talk, this is something we talk about a lot, which is that the pricing in the CAISO frequently does not make sense. This is very indicative of pricing. What you would expect to see is that real-time prices, 5-minute prices, would be higher than 15-minute prices, especially during periods of, constraint or periods of scarcity. You would want the 5-minute prices to be higher because you would want to incent resources and imports to come into the market. And instead, what we see, likely due to, this, if you remember, this is the RDR or the RMR, the RMR out of market dispatch. We also have a lot of RDRR in here. And when you deploy these programs, you end up crashing the 5-minute price. Sometimes it's because you can incorporate the programs into the 15-minute price itself, but it's not in the 5-minute. Sometimes it's simply because all of a sudden it looks like you have a bunch of free excess capacity, and because of supply and demand, it crashes the price. But either way, this is not great for the market. And you can see the impact here again. So I just wanted to illustrate this. This is the same CAISO EIM transfer chart I showed before. And you could see like prices matter. This is not hypothetical. If you crash the real-time price, what happens is you get less transfers. This happens internal to EIM, this will happen in EDAM, and this happens whether we're competing for market imports. So prices matter. So now I'm just going to go through a couple weird pricing things we noticed. We haven't drilled down and figured out exactly why they happened, but they did happen. So we thought we'd just highlight them for people. So the first thing that happened that was a little weird is that CAISO prices reached $2,000 in the 15-minute market only on September 5th, when the EEA2 was called. And so that's the purple line right here. And you see it went up to $2,000. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I saw prices and they were $5,000. And yes, you did, but they had congestion in them and were not pervasive across the footprint. What we're showing here is that when the EEA2 was called multiple times on the 5th, prices went to $2,000 for everybody. And that oddly only happened on the 5th. And on the 6th, we didn't see prices hit. We didn't see prices hit $2,000, and I'm not quite sure why. Additionally, the 15-minute, of course, remained higher than the 5-minute, which is disappointing. We really would need some sort of system where if the $2,000 is hit, probably administratively, maybe there was scarcity, we're still not sure why, you would want that to feed into the 5-minute market, because ultimately it's the 5-minute market that dictates transfers. Okay, and then one more weird pricing thing that maybe I'm not going to spend too much time on it because maybe it'll get price corrected away, but if anyone has an idea why this happened, be super interested. On the 7th and on, I think it's 8th, yeah, on the 8th, we saw negative prices in the 5-minute market in hours 20 and 21. And I have no idea why. I mean, I have some theories, I suppose, but to me, that seems really weird. And again, you could just see this pervasive trend where you have the 15-minute market just so much higher than the 5-minute market. And that's true in particular on the 8th as well. And again, you just get these weird negative prices. So if these are price corrected ever, I'll update these charts on the website. But just odd, and then it's particularly odd that it happened 2 days in a row, which makes me think perhaps it has to do with exceptional dispatches or some unit that couldn't turn offline, perhaps the RMRs, because loads were lower on September 7th and 8th. So if the CAISO ended up exceptionally dispatching like they did on the 6th or the 5th when the loads were higher, it could be, 30, this one. It could be that, just too much ED led to, not being able to turn off prices, or not to be able to turn off plants fast enough, which led to negative prices, but we will see. Okay, and then finally, just a tiny bit, because Jeff, I think, has more on this, but just to note that congestion really impacted the northern BAAs more than others. So what this shows is if you group all the EIM BAAs together, what were they have, what were their average prices. So a DLAP is an internal CAISO LMP, and ELAP is an EIM LMP. So we're just showing you here that, okay, the dotted line is the average system marginal energy cost, and then you could see the congestion differences, for example, between the BC Hydro, super low, compared to CAISO, very, very high. And all those price differences were solely driven by congestion. Just a couple more pricing things that were interesting to me. Ancillary services seem to respond as expected. We actually did get some high real-time prices on September 6th, and then on a couple other days. That pricing appeared rational to us. And flex ramp up, we never get flex ramp up pricing. This was very exciting. We actually had flex ramp up reach the cap at 250 multiple times in multiple areas. So it seems like even without the enhancements coming from flex ramp up, we actually saw some good price signals there. And then finally, I think I showed this chart multiple times in other circumstances, but this is just to note that, again, we were decking EIM. So this is the dark blue is EIM transfers into the CAISO in the 15-minute market. Here's the 5-minute market. So we were decking imports here, but we were also decking unspecified imports at the same time. So you could see that transfers, price responsive transfers, be it EIM areas or unspecified imports, tend to follow the same trend because they really are just solely responsive to these price signals. You could also see, I think, the magnitude different too. People sometimes ask me, you know, how much does EIM matter? Are we getting a ton of capacity from EIM? And yes, we are getting significant amounts of transfers from EIM entities, but we're getting even more from unspecified imports. So just, this is my final slide, and these are just, take these as very loose initial observations. We are still thinking through these. So the first one is something I already mentioned. You know, what are the drivers of, you know, negative prices during emergency conditions? And I think that that must be due to out of market action, likely exceptional dispatches, but that is such a weird thing to see during emergency conditions. I think negative prices have to be due to something the CAISO is doing behind the scenes. And the next thing to think about is, why is the SMEC only reaching $2,000 in EEA2 just for a few periods? Why aren't we seeing more sustained peak pricing? And there could be a couple things driving this, and I don't want to get into the first one too much, but it could be that if we're cutting FMM exports, that could be impacting the price. So it could be that we did some cuts and that this is what caused us to do the reach the $2,000 per megawatt hour price. But because of other out of market actions, it really is taking something extreme like cutting exports for us to reach that price. Again, that's just a working theory. We need to dig into the data more and probably have the CAISO tell us, because while we could see exports being cut, it's really hard to differentiate. Well, actually, so we could see exports being cut in day ahead and in the hourly real-time market, but the CAISO doesn't publish data for 15-minute or 5-minute. So we don't know, for example, if there was an export cut in the 15-minute market and that's what led to the $2,000, because that data simply doesn't exist. And then finally, drivers of the 5-minute price continuing to come in below the 15-minute price. There's multiple reasons for this. One we've noted multiple times, which is that there's no co-optimization of ancillary services in the 5-minute market. So if there's scarcity or high prices being driven by AS in the 15-minute, that won't show up in the 5. Demand response bidding and the ability to set marginal prices typically is not in the 5-minute market. Most programs at best are in the 15. So if there's any sort of DR setting the price, it can only do that in the 15-minute market. And then maybe there's some lower loads or something's happening between the 15 and 5, consumer actions potentially that are driving those price differences. Okay, so just to wrap it up, because I think I promised Scott I would only take 45 minutes. Just want to think very high level about the next decade. So 3 things I think about all the time. The first one is resource adequacy planning. As I talked about, the way we do resource adequacy planning is improving, significantly improved compared to a few years ago, but still needs a lot of work. I think at a baseline, we need to agree as a state, we're going to plan for a 1 in 10. We have to get rid of this fake planning reserve margin that we've been using forever. Until recently, it was 15%. Now it's somewhere between 17 and 22.5%, depending on who you're talking to. It's quite ridiculous. But we need to actually agree. We're going to plan to a 1 in 10, and hey, maybe throw on something for climate change, or talk to the CEC about this great climate change, demand forecast they're using, and use that in the 1 in 10. To me, that seems very reasonable. We also need something to fill the gap between our 1-year RA program and that 10-year planning process. Rapid decarbonization means we can't just do a 10-year lookout and then recheck each year. We need something in the middle. And then finally, I'll just make the pitch for this. I think that the CAISO should probably get more involved in planning. It's going to be so coordinated with transmission. They're the ones who ultimately get to decide whether a gas plant gets to retire or not. They're going to need to be able to look out more than 1 year ahead to say whether a retirement works for grid reliability. So those are my general thoughts on that. Next is I am just generally terrified about lack of intertie liquidity and the availability of imports as we go down EDAM, as RAP evolves, as SPP could expand. Seams issues are really hard, and it's not something that CAISO has ever had to really deal with before. But if we have a RAP program that is procuring more megawatts and telling their members that they have to hold them back in case their members need them, that means those megawatts aren't going to be available to the CAISO anymore. And I think the RAP is a great program, and I am so impressed by it, and I think it's a huge step forward for the Western region. But I also think there's going to be impacts that we haven't talked about yet on intertie liquidity, and we depend so heavily on them, as I've just shown you. I think it could cause reliability challenges unless we address it up front. And then finally, we have to talk about the gas fleet retirements at some point in time. We can't just assume we're going to build out enough storage and solar and every last gas megawatt is going to hang on in an emergency to save us. We have to think about the pricing. We have to think about an orderly transition. And I think I first said orderly transition of gas retirements in 2014 when I worked for the CAISO, but maybe we should actually do it now. And it's nice that we had this heat wave and we didn't black out, because that means perhaps we could take a step back without the politics, without, finger pointing, and say, hey, let's look holistically at the system. Okay.
Thanks, Carrie. That certainly is a lot to chew on, and we do have a number of questions which we need to get to, and I will hold my own questions in favor of the members on this. I will first get to the one member. Most of the questions came in the Q&A or the chat box, but what I'll do is go to the first, the only member who came in with a question where they raised their hand and wants to talk, and that's Kevin Cito. So Kevin, if you're on, you've been I've unmuted you. Why don't you unmute yourself now that you why don't you unmute yourself now that I've sort of given the done it from here. Well, Kevin, I think you've reconsidered. Okay. So let me go to the Q&A and the chat. One of them, I think you answered. They were asking, how would you rate this in a 1 times, 10, 20? I think you came in to say, Carrie, this was a 1. The peak was a 1 in 20.
We were higher than 1 in 20. Yeah. So for the mid case that the CEC produces, we were higher than a 1 in 20 demand scenario.
Yeah. Okay. in the Q&A box, one of the questions we've come in the is, let me see. Did you say the CAISO dispatched all batteries down to a zero charge? Does that include batteries that have elected to manage their own state of charge?
Yeah, so on September 7th, I think it was, I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that's right. The CAISO did exceptional dispatches, which basically says don't follow your market signal, listen to us instead. And they dispatched everyone down to preserve the state of charge for the peak period.
Okay. Question came in that says, how is a low and high priority determined?
Oh, that is a very complicated question. So a low and high priority or export are determined in each individual market, day ahead, rock, real time, depending on how you bid and whether you've designated a non-RA resource, and then whether that designated non-RA resource gets scheduled sufficient to support your export bid. We actually have produced a table for that at kind of a cheat sheet for the CAISO committee. If you're interested, please email me and I will send you that cheat sheet. It's quite complicated.
Also, Carrie, Tyler Walford said, Carrie, we saw the same thing, negative or very low real-time prices in SPP during Winter Storm Uri. I think you hit it. Operators committed too much generation and it caused real-time prices to plummet. We also saw imports from other markets and specifically those import tags being cut, then reloaded, coincident with some of the odd low real-time pricing. And another comment, I'm not very familiar with CAISO intricacies, but saw this is funny. Saw a Twitter poster, somebody on Twitter saw his energy storage had a $1,000 energy offer cap, but cost to charge was at times $2,000, which sends odd or uneconomic pricing to storage resources. Did you see any of this, or is Twitter a bad place to gather information?
No, well, yes, Twitter is a terrible place to gather information, but that is actually accurate. So due to the CAISO offer rules, if you're a resource-specific resource within CAISO, so storage, if you're a battery in the CAISO, your offer cap is $1,000 to discharge. However, prices can rise above that in other hours because someone else can set a price. So certainly, yes, some people did have to charge at above $1,000 prices, and then they end up having to discharge and can't even bid higher than 1,000. There is something called bid cost recovery. So ultimately the storage resource will be made whole to its costs. It won't be made whole to its opportunity costs or the ability to actually make money in the market, but it won't ultimately end up owing the CAISO money. But yeah, no, that's true to Twitter story.
Okay, but don't always believe Twitter. Does CAISO publish after the fact the amount of exceptional dispatches?
Yes, there is a report to FERC that they have to report on at least all non-RA exceptional dispatches. And I think exceptional dispatches at least get aggregated and reported on in the monthly reports and then in DMM as well. It is, however, not specific enough to be useful in terms of figuring out pricing. For example, they don't show the amount of megawatts dispatched hourly, which is really what I would need to do a thorough price analysis.
One question came in, how are you defining unspecified imports? Non-resource specific as defined in the CAISO tariff business practice model, or two, unspecified using the CARB definition? I assume it's one, but I just don't know.
Yeah, great question. I will never use the CARB definition for anything because I'm not a CARB expert and that would really scare me. So no, the first one, the CAISO definition.
A comment, okay, I think you're right to be terrified about lack of liquidity at the enterprise. I'm terrified about the lack of RA for 2023.
Yeah, me too. A lot of my clients are having trouble. A lot of people I know are having trouble finding RA for 23. And they'll probably be short. So.
Yeah, I seem to recall we had this discussion after the 2020 the 2020 heat wave, and then we were looking at a Q3 2021, and the prices were ridiculously high and got immediately high. Let me see. Oh, wait a minute. Travis Kavula has his hand raised. Travis, I'm now unmuting you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. So we
lovely.
can hear you.
I'm not even here just to defend Twitter, though. I'm
Well, I wanted to hear
needed.
your melodious voice.
No, well, I just want, mixing it up for you and Carrie, Scott. No, my question was about demand response. I mean, Carrie, I hear you saying that, actual demand shows up higher than the procurement mandate for RA, which, leads me to think, demand response that validates the take that I did see on Twitter a lot, that demand response played a pretty important role here. I wonder if you have early impressions of how much of that is the kind of, public spirited, uncompensated social demand response as a result of flex alerts and text messages from the governor versus how much is sort of programmatic or market based.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually have a fun slide here that might help answer this a little bit. So here's just the hourly change in demand. And fundamentally what you see from any DR program is that as demand drops, DR is supposed to drop it faster than expected, right? Because all of the DR was deployed not as we were approaching the peak, but as we were at the peak or going down. So it's really hard to say how effective was the DR because the load is already dropping. What we want from the DR is to drop the load even faster, right? So how do we determine how great things were? Well, so what I did here is on the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, I just said, okay, what was the average load drop over time? How much was load dropping from hour to hour? And what you end up seeing here, and this is just the negatives, right? Just the negative side. You see from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. on the 6th, you see this pretty significant drop. You also see a pretty significant drop though on the 7th, right? From here to here. Now, this drop is just natural load drop plus demand response. This slightly bigger green drop, it includes that emergency alert that we got on our phone. Typically, it's harder to get response from DR programs. The earlier in the day, there was also a DR event called on the 7th at 4 p.m. that you could see didn't really do anything to drop demand. So, I think did something, maybe 1,000 megawatts, which is quite a lot for sending an alert out. I personally think that on the 6th, we probably would have had to drop load if we didn't send out that emergency alert and if we didn't get that response we did from Californians. But is it something that we should rely on? Is demand response somehow as equal to, maybe a gas generator? No. But did it help? Yeah, it helped a whole heck of a lot. I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you, Travis. Data still to come on that.
Well, and normally I would allow Travis to have a follow-on, but we've got time constraints.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So we've got. Let me quickly go to the questions on the Q&A box so that we get.
Oh, quickly, I see Kelsey asked whether the imports published include pseudo-ties, dynamically tagged imports, and yes, they do. Okay. But so the non-specified don't include that. The specified imports include that.
That's a clarification.
Yeah.
I think you sort of touched on this. What protocol allowed the CAISO to dispatch batteries to zero state of charge? Let's see.
Yeah, exceptional dispatch. Any resource that has a participating generator agreement with the CAISO, it basically allows the CAISO to take their asset over and as needed by the CAISO. And
at times the CAISO outage report had, let me see, greater than 1 gigawatt of batteries in it. Is this correct? Were there greater than 1 gigawatt battery outages one time or another during the event?
I did see that. I think that is accurate. My guess is what happened is the battery cycled more times than their contract limitations, or maybe, I don't know, got too hot. I don't know, but I can confirm I saw that as well in the outages.
The heat did seem to have an effect on some of the, at least some of the solar resources. How has CAISO released the load bias numbers? Do you think the load bias might explain higher real-time price transfer and prices?
Let's see. The CAISO does not release their real-time load bias numbers, and that's what we would need to know to answer this question. So unfortunately, they are getting better with the data, but we can't see how they're biasing the load forward in the multi-interval optimization. I do think that could explain the phenomena you're describing, though.
I'm just going to rapidly go through some of these so we can get to Jeff's. What would load look like if the weather had occurred outside the Labor Day holiday? I guess you can speculate on that.
I don't know. I don't know. I think the one interesting thing is that it did occur on the Labor Day holiday, and it also occurred a day later and pretty similar. So maybe there wouldn't be significant impacts from the holiday. I don't know, TBD.
Isn't the load forecast inclusive of ancillary service requirements or just load?
The load forecast is just load, not inclusive. Usually it's broken out. So if it's my load forecasts are all just load, except for where it says load plus reserves in the summer report.
Okay. On the topic of firm export curtailments, did CAISO direct the curtailment of firm exports during the EEA events?
I don't believe so. The CAISO has said no, they did not cut any firm exports. However, there is a scenario where you had a high priority. Oh wait, you said firm, not high priority. Okay, so this is a little confusing because the CAISO calls both high priority and low priority exports are considered firm, and low priority exports were cut. So under that definition of firm, then yes, firm exports were cut during multiples of the EEA events. Okay. But yeah, that's when you talk about firm in the OAT world, it's different than firm in the CAISO world, and it's different pre and post 2020. So all very
Yep, it'll be interesting doing this in an EDAM's context. At the EDAM meeting, the CAISO announced a peak of 52,061 megawatts. Can you react to that number? That comes from Brian Thaker. So we have to answer it.
Yeah, I sometimes their peak includes things other than what we see in the data. So I'm not sure why that's higher. Perhaps pumping load, or they're adding in something that we can't see. But the data that we do see is more like a little over 5,100 megawatts.
Okay, 51,000.
51,000, yeah.
Yeah, I think Carrie touched on this already, but do we know if CAISO cut any export tags in real time that were awarded in the day ahead market?
Yes, we do know that they did that in what's called HASP, the hour ahead market. We don't know whether they cut high priority exports, but we do know they did cut some export tags.
And Gary Ackerman wants to clarify slide 37 only had some September 5 data displayed rather than September 6. I think that was like you had high prices September. He's asking because you had high prices the 5th and lower prices the 6th.
And I did include the 6th. Okay, I will add. Thanks, Gary. I will add the 6th.
Don't thank Gary. Let me go back and quickly. I think we got.
Yeah, we should let Jeff go now.
Yeah, Jeff. Let's now go to Jeff Richter. Jeff, unmute yourself. Yep. And why don't you bring your slides up?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, now you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Cool. Thanks, Carrie. That was great in-depth analysis on a 72-hour impromptu request. So appreciate all the insight. So Jeff Richter, Energy GPS Principal Owner. We cover the market fundamentals as well from all the West, and I was tasked to kind of look at it through the lens of what the other BAs were doing at the time. And it's going to touch back on points that Carrie pointed out, because at the end of the day, it's all going to go down to isothermal. And we saw that react because that's where the rubber meets the road, unless you decide somehow along the way that you want to send a price signal earlier through energy to get under unutilized capacity. So, and that's mostly in the desert Southwest, not the Northwest, but there's going to be times that I think we're in this urgency window, as Carrie said, not today, because we got through last week, but over the next 18 to 24 months, there are situations that are percolating out here across the West that has to have everybody thinking aloud and together on how to go about this, because at the end of the day, there's just not enough capacity, and Mother Nature has some things to do with it. Luck has some things, unlucky has some things to do with it, but also just the structural changes that are going on in the market, both through demand and also through policy, that we will highlight, but we won't go in depth with. So with that being said, let's just go through the slides. First thing I'm going to talk about is the power demand. And we all know it was hot in California. So looking at that, the big thing to take away here, I think, is the desert Southwest continued down its path of being what I would call average to a little bit above average when it comes to demand. It wasn't super hot down there, and we could see that through the loads not changing throughout the heat wave. They basically sat here. Now, as we got further into the tail end of the heat wave, the desert Southwest got a lot looser, which we could see in the transmission flows, we could see in the volume that pushed into California. The Pacific Northwest, I think this is a topic we talk about a lot. I think as a market, it has been discussed quite a bit. Is the heat dome from 2 years ago really, I think, changed the landscape up here, because we have more AC demand in the northern part of our Pacific Northwest. So you don't have to get as hot anymore to get our demand response. And I'll show you a graph next that shows us that temperatures rising in the Seattle-Tacoma area are giving us, in the same temperature bin, more demand. And that's because you read PAC's forecast, you read Puget's, you read Seattle's, everybody's out there, is they got new demand coming in play with ACs units being put in place, along with electric vehicles, along with cannabis, along with you name it. There's more demand off the same temperature bins. We don't need the extremes anymore to keep megawatts at home. I like to show this graph because this is Puget Sound's heavy load demand by year, with the blue being 2022, the orange being 2021, and the red being 2020, pandemic year. I highlighted the 74 to 80 degree temperature here because you can see a structural change the further we go to the right. So little note is in August, July, maybe even June, because that's when we saw the heat dome, but also in September, it wasn't that hot this time around, but we do have incremental demand that is structural up here, which ties into our supply demand here, which means if I don't have all the pieces singing together here, it's just less that I can give to California. And we're going to get into the pricing mechanism here in a second, but there is structural demand up here. We got lucky last week because of this. You can see that our demand actually is down from the first and second. But if this heat would have been here during this heat wave, I think we would have had a little bit different operations going on when it comes to mid-sea pricing and stuff like that. Pacific Northwest Hydro. I think I wanted to highlight here because we are in a heck of a water year in 2022 that is extended off into the months of August and September. And I pointed out that you could see they turned up the crank here. Now, how much does that help California is a real question, because I argue on a typical day, we're already optimizing the midday to evening ramp transmission capacity from an energy standpoint. So evening ramp period, you can't get much more through the spigot unless you have more transmission capacity. So it favors us to keep the capacity there, but it doesn't give us incremental volume that can flow down into California. For example, Carrie's load numbers went from 43, call it, or 44 to 51. We cannot get more transmission that will equate to balancing out that California load. We might get 200 to 300 megawatts more, but we're not getting thousands more on a normal day, which means you got to go directly to thermal or resort to the desert Southwest. They tried to stretch this system, and this one bends up the flex ramp, I call it, between midday hour ending 13 to hour ending 20. And what you can see, the month of September this year has really stretched the system right here in the first 8 days. The month of August did the same thing. If you go back to 2020, when we had another good water year, we never reached this stretching because you just run out of water come August and September. So we're blessed this year with a good water year to at least keep the megawatts at the same capacity in the evening ramp, because we can't exceed that. What do I mean by that? Let's look at the transmission flows. You can see here the AC and the DC is all of the transmission that goes down into California, not just the CAISO. So we looked at that, then we broke down Desert Southwest, Packy, Knob, and then Palo and Meade as part of individual ties going here. But I want to focus on this one right here, because on the first and second, it looks like we peaked out at 6.4 or 5.7 gigawatts during the evening ramp of sending north to south megawatts. During the heat wave, we got up to 8, but we dropped down to 7.6. So it looks like we gave more to California from the first and second to the heat wave over Labor Day. The next slide, though, is this is all a function of price signal, because I went back and looked at the days in August when Mid-C priced under SP15, picked a certain amount of days when Mid-C priced over SP15 in the bilateral market, and then the heat wave period of the 3rd through the 8th. When Mid-C prices under SP15, let's say, or NP15, we can say in this market, we get anywhere from 7 to 7.2 gigawatts during the evening ramp. Days when we need to keep it up here, that thing pulls back to 3.8, 5.2, 4.6. So we lose, or California loses, evening ramp megawatts when Mid-C wants to outprice it. Fast forward here, Tuesday, Mid-C priced over, but we still got 7.5. These other days, Mid-C priced under, and we got 7.3. So my point is, during this heat wave, when our demand was stretching in California, my Pacific Northwest added maybe 0.3 to 0.7 BCF or gigawatts of generation to the system. That's not even close to what the net got stretched within California's net load, because our demand was going up higher than anything here. And you can see that in the Packy, the same thing. We do not add that many more megawatts just because it's getting hot in California. We actually add less when the Mid-C is just as hot. We got fortunate that it wasn't. They were able to ramp up some hydro to keep us at least whole. Now, what you do see here is the Palo Verde stuff. There's underutilized capacity in the desert Southwest, in the day ahead real-time flows that are sitting out here. It just so happens that Palo Verde is pricing over California to keep megawatts at home. Once we saw the load falling off like we did on the 8th, what did we see happen? The desert Southwest start delivering more megawatts. So one place that's underutilized in the day ahead basis is the desert Southwest, if there's generation over there, because the desert Palo Verde is pricing, Mead is pricing over that of California by a substantial amount for many different reasons that we all talked about since 2020 that Carrie alluded to, of cutting firm exports all the way down from day ahead into real time, non-CAISO firm power contracts that are going on out there. But the desert Southwest says, not on my watch am I going to let you, or I'm going to outprice you to bring those in. Mid-C does that occasionally, or more often than not now. And if this would have been here, California would have needed to find roughly, call it 2,500 megawatts more when it's already tight to the system if we would have had circumstances a little different up here. That's a pretty big number, 2,500, when you're already stretching the system. Flex Alert, as Carrie pointed out, would have to add another 2,500 megawatts of demand being turned off, let alone some unit tripping and stuff like that. That's the fine line that we're on here as we go forward throughout the rest of this month, next month, and the next 2 years and beyond. If you can't get more down from the Northwest and the desert doesn't want to bring more in, you got to sit on the thermal fleet. And I do want to give the shout out to batteries because of, without them this year, the CAISO would have been in a big situation. So it did respond. We went into the minutia of, did it respond perfectly? There's days when it didn't. We talked about that like Carrie did. And then as we progressed, we saw the volume go down on the 7th and 8th due to outages and factors that were going into things only the CAISO knows. But you know, it should get a shout out that this capacity was so valuable because our transmission can only give us so much, and there's a higher probability of giving us less when you're from the desert and potentially in the Northwest. I put this graph in here because I like to carve it out into morning ramp, midday, and evening and build up the stack. The purple is where I like to focus here, is the amount of thermal that was needed on this system with everything running and producing on average 25.5 gigawatts on the 7. We are maxed out. So if you combine that with a situation where Mid-C would want to keep megawatts at home, the next alternative is to find some demand to turn off because there's just nothing else that we can do at these levels. Now, we could get wind, we could get solar to extend itself, which we know can happen into the evening ramp. But on hot days, we know that that wind's not going to blow. They tried to stretch the hydro system in state as well, but there's only so much you can do there at the end of the day. They're already maximizing that the best they can every single day on the price signal that's put out there. So when push comes to shove, Mid-C might want to keep things at home, which puts more of the burden of what are we going to do, California? If I'm not going to price over Palo, I'm not going to get my underutilized capacity in the day ahead to flow megawatts that way. So I'm left with sending out alerts and doing demand response, or now flex alerts to get that on-demand response volume to balance my system because I have nothing else. And as Carrie alluded to, what's this thermal fleet going to look like going forward? We know the conversations around Diablo Canyon on the nuclear side, now the ones through cooling, and everything else is because this thermal is needed. And transmission capacity is getting tighter and tighter as we move forward. I like to look at it through the eyes of two ways. Is one, through the total generation thermal through the bins of procurement. And you can see this September through the heat wave, it has topped the last 10 years of total thermal needed. So as we get into global warming, as we get into higher structural demand and more renewables, this thermal fleet is needed more and more as we go forward. And we can see that with this heat. The other thing that we noticed was stretching the system, I call it. This is where CAISO was turning on all this thermal demand because it was needed for what I call base load in the middle of the day, not just ramping for the evening ramp, because last year it was utilizing its thermal with more flex between hour ending 13 and 20 of ramping up. This year I needed it more for my base load because my demand was so much higher. I had nothing else to turn to but this thermal fleet. And I think part of it is I turned it on so I could get it for the evening ramp throughout this period. Congestion, this is a little pet peeve of mine. I still argue that transmission should be, capacity should be known more transparently through the public forum, not just through people that have ties to it and what the ratings are, because I do think this helps the market adjust to trying to where the megawatts are needed. For example, how much is flowing on path 26 on a day ahead basis? How much can flow? What are these ratings going into the system? Because they are trying to do everything, but the market needs to be able to be a part of that as well. And congestion was seen in the middle of the day, not during the evening ramp like it was previously. So as load goes up across the board, it allows megawatts to flow more fluidly. And that was a bonus there too, because if there was a constraint, I think you just island off, be it the LA basin, and that will create gobs and gobs of problems because you are going to not let these megawatts flowing. So seeing where that transmission is and knowing what the flows are, to me personally, is very helpful on a market standpoint, because it needs to be symbolic to balancing out this system as a whole and where these megawatts need to come from going forward. And we see a lot of congestion this summer. A lot of it's south to north when the solar and the loads are down, but we see it even on these high day, medium tier days that can not have the temperature get as hot, but have the same kind of outcome because congestion starts playing into it. So I know the CAISO talks about it a lot. I know every entity is thinking about it because of islanding off the grid, and that this exposes a lot of things as we go forward. The future factors, and this is where, the market fundamentals, I always say the weather events, 1 in 30 years with global warming. What does this mean? With structural changes in the whole West, every area has to cover and understand what's going on above them, to the right, and over into the Rockies, because things are changing pretty rapidly. It's not just weather causing it. We have, the timing of it. We have the Pacific Northwest hydro. I think just normal hydro conditions this year doesn't extend us into the August and September. With our load growth that we're seeing in the Northwest, that gives us more opportunity, or the market, to have mid-sea price over, which then keeps megawatts at home. And if California is dependent on them, that changes how the balancing works inside of California. We see it in Palo Verde all summer. And I think the last thing that I like to think about in my head is battery is the latest technology. Is the battery capacity outpacing the structural load growth in not only California, but across the way, because that it ties into the import side of things as well, because those megawatts flowing that you always expected in years past from different regions are now staying at home because they're priced to stay at home. I think there's a lot of structural and policy changes going on. One of the structural things we alluded to was the Pacific Northwest power demand. We got Washington carbon, we got the RAP, we got supply chain shortages. I think this is something that everybody's been talking about and looking at, is what is the new build capacity look like going forward in the next 18 months when it comes to solar technology, battery technology, because there is all this, besides mandates, there's all this supply chain shortage and price formation that is delaying certain projects throughout. And that is something that we need to watch closely over the next 18 months. I think the Western hydro outlook is pretty important, because the Northwest is tightening up its system just by changing its spill requirements. Not only is it driven off of every year's weather, we got different conditions on the hydro system on different times of the year, and those keep changing to where the system only gets tighter, not looser. And that then restricts flexibility in the Northwest, then turns to keeping megawatts at home, which then exposes other regions, be it Palo, Rockies, and or California as we go forward. California drought-like conditions. I think the hydro system in California has done a great job this year of maximizing and learning over the years how to stretch their hourly 7 by 22, between hours 7 through 22 ramp. And they continue to do it because price tells you to do it, but also they're learning as they go throughout this. But with less water, less flex, they got restrictions on their system as well. And it's been noted millions of times in several different places in regards to the desert Southwest point of no return. And I think this is something that is a blind spot, but it's pertinent, and we've kind of dug into it, make sure we can handle it, because as the desert loses some of their flex, that position gets very tight very quickly. And we all know about Lake Mead. The aging thermal fleet, what are you going to do with that? And I think, as we've seen over the next 18 to 24 months, this is happening more and more to where we're just at the cusp. We make it through, but I think we could go to about 5 or 6 things that would be just a little different, that would give us a time to pause to go, oh my gosh, we were that close to certain things on the grid that, you know, we all tried to rid ourselves of, and that's rolling blackouts or situations where we just don't have enough energy within not only California, but across the whole West. So we skated by this time. I think everybody needs to still continue to come together, which we talked about as a group many times, on just the market fundamentals and structural changes and what needs to be put in place to make sure we all know what's going on in all the different regions. Because as Carrie said, Scott's alluded to, I think California is dependent upon what I call the import volume, and these other regions are willing to and needing to keep it at home going forward more often than they used to. My contact information will be on there if you want to talk more in depth on the Northwest, and I will open it up to questions, Scott, if there are any.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a great way of sort of providing what the extraordinarily detailed amount of information that Carrie provided on inside CAISO and around it. But it was a great way to sort of provide some context to it, to how this is affecting CAISO and how everybody else is being affected, because we are in a symbiotic relationship. We're up against the end of the time frame we've got. I'm just checking to see. We've got have been a number of questions with regard to the availability of this. Again, will be available on the WPTF website. It will be on the Gridwell Carrie's will be available on the Gridway website, and Jeff's, yours will be available on the Energy GPS website. But on the WPTF website, both of them will be available. And it'll be on the WPTF website. It'll be on the resources tab, and it'll be called the California Weather Emergency. We call it California, but of course, this is a Western. We do have one question that I wanted to pose to you, Jeff. It says, do megawatts get held back further in mid-C and Cal 23 due to Washington carbon? I guess he's just asking your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, to be determined. I mean, it's all going to be driven by, the price and the, if this, draw your bubble about Washington and the source and the sink of it. And at the end of the day, if they're going to price higher, they're going to stay at home. At the end of the day, that's just where they're going to stay.
Right.
So there's a higher potential.
But I don't think Washington carbon really takes effect till 24, isn't that right? I think it's 24.
I thought it was January 2023.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's January 2023.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, for participating in this. I just want to sort of put a bow on this. What I've seen several things that we need to pay attention to. One has to do with RA planning. It's probably not been robust enough, particularly in California. And of course, there's this disconnect between RA planning in California and what the rest of the West is doing. Hydro was available in greater amount than we can reasonably expect going forward, so we got lucky there. We didn't have outages to any great degree in California. Weather elsewhere was moderate. If you factor all this in here, last week could have been really, and by the way, CAISO did a great job. I think we really do need to sort of say, put our hands together for CAISO. They did a very effective grid management, but they got lucky. We all got lucky. So the issue is that we probably need to digest this information. And I'm going to suggest that sometime in October, and we'll get back to you, we probably should plan to have a roundtable as we've digested this information to talk further, and hopefully we'll include some people from the CEC, and regulators from surrounding states to talk through sort of lessons learned and what we need to do as a region, because this isn't a California situation. This isn't a Pacific Northwest situation. It's not a desert Southwest situation. It's a Western situation to talk about what we need to do. Thank you to everybody. Again, this presentation has been recorded, and in addition to the presentations themselves being on the WPTF website, we will have the recording up on the WPTF website probably tomorrow, but the presentations themselves will be up on the WPTF website later today. Thanks very much to Jeff, Carrie. You guys did a great job. Great questions. And thanks, Frank, for operating back there in Sacramento. And hope to talk to you all about this later. Thanks.